Welcome to the Being Known podcast with my friend, Dr. Curt Thompson.
My friend, Pepper Sweeney.
We are here to discover and explore what it means to be truly known. Hey, Curt.
Pep, man, it's been a while since we've been back in the recording seats, and I just can't tell you how great it is to see your face and hear your voice, and lots happened since we've last talked together. Yeah.
You are full force into the launch of your newest book, which we're here to talk about today, and very excited about this book. And so already hearing from so many people who are being impacted by your work, which is just awesome, Curt. I'm really grateful for that. The book is The Soul of Desire, Discovering the Neuroscience of Longing, Beauty, and Community. This season, our third season of the Being Known podcast, is dedicated to this book. So please go out and purchase it wherever you find your books, and so that you'll be ready to go through this season, and it will mean more to you. And I think the book there'll be some enlightening things about the book along the way. And it's a real great sort of simpatico thing happening between the podcast and the book. It's been really fun. Today we were going to be talking about chapter 6, which is Imagine That, looking at what we don't see, which of course you couldn't just say, looking at what you don't see. All right.
I think, wait, just to be clear, it's what you don't yet see.
Okay. What you don't yet see. So
right.
The yet is important.
Right.
Shouldn't leave
as opposed to Yeti, which is also important. You and I both have them
in my hand right now.
Right on.
Just before we jump in, I just wanted to say, Curt, today I went this morning, just out of curiosity, I went on to Apple Podcasts, and I went down and looked at some of our reviews, and I am just blown away by what people are saying about the podcast. I mean, and if you are someone who is enjoying the podcast, please go and rate it and review it, because it helps spread the word about the podcast. But really, I was just humbled by just the amazing things that people are saying. A couple of them mentioned you even. So, so you might want to go and take a look at them. You might need to scroll. You might need to scroll for a little while before your name comes up. But,
okay, well, this is so consistent with what my experience has been recently. I'm going places, they're like, oh my gosh, Curt, yeah, you have that podcast, right? We love Pepper. We just love Pepper. This is, and I'm like, yeah. And they said, and do you have a part? Like, I don't know. Are you on that podcast? No, last week. Yeah. That's what they asked.
Yeah.
I tag along. Tag along for it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, my gosh.
Let's jump into chapter 6. I would love to start with, you have a couple of people that you talk about, or in this chapter. We have Ryan and Katrina. And I'd love for you just to sort of talk a little bit about their story, which will help open up some of this stuff for us.
Right. It's a story that is, interestingly enough, it's common to us as humans. One of the first things as we've talked about these confessional communities, and we'll be talking more and more about them and how they work. Some people think, oh my goodness, like these confessional communities, they're artificial. We've constructed them as part of a group therapy. It's this unique thing that only happens in that setting. And there are some elements of it, of course, that's true. But one of the really beautiful things about these confessional communities that we'll talk more about in later episodes is that there's nothing that happens in these confessional communities that is not happening in normal day-to-day come and go life. The difference is the degree to which we are doing certain parts of it on purpose and are consciously aware of, and we take time to pay attention to the processes that are taking place in these exchanges between people. But these are not exchanges that we make up only in a group therapy setting. These are exchanges that take place between, around the kitchen table, in your business meetings with your employees or employer, in your friends, on the basketball court, when you're in your art studio. This is real life. It's just simply real life that we're paying exclusive attention to elements of it that we just don't let ourselves pay attention to. And part of what our hope is for all of us who are listening is that when we get to the end of this book, that we'll see that what we're talking about here is something that we would love to export more consciously and intentionally and in a distilled fashion into real life. And I say all that to say that one of these elements that takes place in real life all the time is this notion that, as our chapter title indicates, is that imagination is something that we as human beings depend upon all day, every day, in order for us to get from one place to the next. I'm imagining a future that is going to be. I walk across the hallway to the water fountain, to the water cooler to get water, because I'm imagining that when I get there, the water cooler is going to work. Now, again, this might sound to some that this is like kind of like, okay, that's just so obvious. Like, right. But when you get there and the water cooler doesn't work, and you're irritated because you were really thirsty, you suddenly discover the amount of energy and power that your imagination is carrying forth. Because what trauma does is that trauma tends to shatter our capacity to imagine. It shatters my capacity to hope. It shatters my capacity to literally create an image in my mind about a future of beauty and goodness. Because that future in my memory, when I anticipate the future, it's so fraught with my remembrance of trauma, of shame, that those neural networks of shame and fear and trauma are all tangled up with the neural networks of my anticipatory mechanism. And so if I am having a really hard time imagining a future that is hopeful, it's because of how trauma has basically put up a bunch of barriers to that, literally in the way my neural networks are firing with each other, which is why when it comes to our healing and our recommissioning and our living into a world of beauty and goodness, we need somebody outside of us to begin to imagine things for us before we can do that. But once they do, once we hear what they're doing, once we begin to see what they are seeing, it begins to coax our brain forward little by little by little. And this is what was true for Ryan and Katrina. Katrina revealed that after a period of time of having had a really difficult time with a work situation, over a period of many, many months, she announced that she was making some changes that took a great deal of courage.
She announced to the group.
She announced to the group that she was making some changes. And these changes didn't just come. She'd had a boss who'd been really pretty abusive. And of course, she just felt stuck in this abusive work relationship, despite the fact that like her job itself, like what she was there to do, she loved doing her job, but she had a boss who was really, really quite overbearing. But over the course of several months being in the group, as she would say later, I learned that when I would go to my work, like I'm taking this group with me in my mind, that when I was having to confront and have the hard conversation with my boss, then eventually go to HR and all the things that she had to do, that she could literally picture where these other people from the group were standing in the office where she's having the conversation. And this is what we mean by the body of Christ. This is what we mean. Like, this isn't just some kind of theological metaphor that Paul, came up with back 2,000 years ago. This is Paul's sense of what is really like. He's peering into a realm that other people can't see. Paul's imagination is racing ahead of everybody else's and drawing us in behind. But like, I'm not going to come up with that unless somebody else does. In the same way that on Holy Saturday, those disciples who are locked behind closed doors, they're not imagining anything but death and destruction.
Right.
And we needed God to imagine Easter, something that not even evil could see coming. And even when Jesus in Luke's gospel is on the road with those travelers to Emmaus, they still don't yet imagine. They have the capacity to imagine this until he breaks bread with them. So we're in this group, we're in this one conversation, and Katrina makes this announcement that after months and months and months of her gathering her courage and taking the community with her, she's made these decisions to, to take these complaints to her job and to HR. And eventually there was all these changes at work because of this courageous work that she did. And in the course of this, Ryan starts to describe that he himself has a story that really has a lot to do with how much courage it takes to step out of one job and move into another job. And he had all kinds of reasons why that wasn't going to work. And it wasn't until he started to hear Katrina tell her story that he began to imagine the possibility that he could do something differently. There were plenty of other people who would say to Ryan, oh, you should do this, or you should just do that, or you should just, trust that you'll be fine, or trust God, or whatever, like, you'll be fine, just go do this. And this, of course, is what we often hear, right? No, you'll be fine, just go do this. Jesus will be with you, or whatever that means. And those things are not untrue, but our memory, tangled up as it is with our traumas, and by traumas, they don't have to be god-awful traumas. They could be the death of 1,000 cuts. It could be growing up in a household where you had to be perfect. It could be growing up in a household where emotion was never described. And so when you really got afraid, or you really got hurt, or all those kinds of things, like, you just had to bury that. And like, you're burning so much energy having to contain your wounding of even those micro traumas, even those micro moments, that energy is not available to you for the courage that it takes to take the next difficult step. But for Ryan, Katrina's story and everyone else's response to her literally began to activate neural networks within him that enabled him to, little by little by little, imagine, what if this could be true for me? And it's not some abstract story that he reads about it in an article. This is a real woman sitting across the room from him, who he has offered comfort to, whom he has encouraged, who then turns back around to him and says, I just want you to know, I know how hard this is. Nobody's just telling Ryan, you're not being courageous enough. You're too much of a pansy. You're not, what's your problem? No, they're saying, like, this is really hard. Let's do this together. And so, as we like to say, before I live into a different future, I must first imagine it, even if it's in only the micro movements that come. And it's really difficult for me to do that without having somebody else begin to do the imaginative work, even if it's just a little bit ahead of me from where I am. And as they do this, I also can begin to imagine things, because we don't do a thing in the world. I don't walk across the room without imagining that the floor is going to hold my footfalls. I don't think in those terms. That's not where I'm consciously paying attention to, but like, that's exactly what's happening. And so today we would say, as N.T. Wright likes to say, that in Jesus, God's future came forward into our present moment and invites us to imagine the real world, capital R, capital W, that God really occupies, and then drawing our imaginations forward with him, even as hard as it may feel at times, because we are not going forward into that future by ourselves.
That doesn't feel easy to me to comprehend, to live in. That doesn't feel like something that's just handed to me and I can put it in my pocket and I'm good.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So do you have a recommendation on how we could do that work, or what? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I again, if you get to the end of Matthew's gospel, and then in Luke's gospel, you find that even at the ascension, right? The story of the ascension, I believe it's in Matthew's gospel, the story of the ascension, there's been all this time since the resurrection, and Jesus has been with several, and as it recorded later in the New Testament, that there was one episode in which he was present to 500 people at one time. But you get to the ascension, and the passage reads in Luke's gospel, but some still did not believe. And you can imagine, if I were one of those folks who'd been following Jesus, and there was all this hope, and that hope gets shattered by crucifixion. And then he's back with resurrection. And then he leaves a different way. I just want to say that if he's leaving, that departure can easily activate my felt remembrance of being abandoned. It activates those neural networks of like, what was it like for me when he was crucified? And now he's leaving again. There are times when our stories, our remembered experiences of trauma, shame, and fear, again, not just big moments, but even in the smaller moments, can have so much collective power that anytime God moves forward just a little bit into the fog and says, hey, follow me, listen to my voice. I know that you can't see me right now, but I want you to see these folks that you're with, just one little step at a time. How can we do this? That momentary disappearance, like an infant whose mom goes around the corner and the infant can't see mom. And because mom can't be seen, mom's essentially disappeared, and creates this existential overwhelm for the infant. And the infant is in distress because the infant can't see mom seeing her, can't see mom seeing him. It becomes terrifying. And so it becomes easier not to believe. It becomes easier not to hope. It becomes easier not to imagine a new future, because there's too much risk that I'm going to let myself walk into the future and then you're going to leave again and again and again and again. And I'm not stupid, so I'm not going to do this. But it is those very parts of us that have been traumatized and abandoned and disintegrated that God comes to heal. But eventually that healing process invites us to move forward, to expand our imagination, to take greater risk. And so we are in this practice of being invited by God, being invited by our confessional community to expand our imagination. But we, as we said here before, we don't believe we live in a neutral universe. We believe that we live in a universe where evil has a bullseye on our chests. And given its tactics and our complicity, we need access. We need to access and invigorate and strengthen the right hemisphere's way of attuning to the world. And in the book, the concrete, practical way that we then begin to look at that is by turning to Psalm 27. And the fourth verse, which we will be unpacking now for the next several episodes, the fourth verse becomes just a crucial place for us to turn and help to recognize how we can begin to expand this imagination, primarily by employing some concrete things, and not just Psalm 27:4, but also the works of art that we will be talking about. How does Psalm 27:4 and the work of art enable us to begin to tap into our right hemisphere's way of attuning to the world, and so be less frightened when God and our confessional community members are inviting us to expand, as Katrina's imagination was expanded, as Ryan's imagination was coaxed into doing the next hard thing that he had to do. When we turn to verse 27, one of the first things that we see, if you read this, we would read that there's this one thing have I asked, one thing will I seek, that I will run after, that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, that I may gaze upon his beauty and that I may inquire in his temple. And just to say initially, like one of the first things is that we recognize that Psalm 27 in general is a psalm that is a plea for help. The whole thing is a plea for help. And when you get to verse 4, you recognize that the fourth verse is a bit out of place. If you were to read the entire psalm, the fourth verse just seems a little wonky, like it just got inserted. But what we come to discover is that, as Robert Alter, the well-known Old Testament Jewish scholar, points out, is that the fourth verse actually is the fulcrum. It's the hinge on which the entire psalm rotates. And you see, the thing is that when I need help, I want to know what the problem is, and I want to know what the solution is. I want to diagnose it and give me the answers. And I want it done quickly. I don't want to have to contemplate. I don't want to, like, the whole notion of just dwelling and gazing. Like, I got problems to solve.
Right.
I got traumas to heal. I got, you know, the whole notion of being like looking at a piece of artwork, and you have problems to solve. Contemplating the beauty of God. Beauty doesn't seem to have any place when we have problems to fix. Maybe later, after the problems are solved, right? This is what we do in our culture.
Yeah, like when you're in that moment where you were talking about earlier, where you have a trauma, whether that's a big trauma or a small trauma, and you feel like you can't see the hope. It's not necessarily a natural thing to say, let me look at some art. Let me see something beautiful. Let me, it's, for me anyway, my experience is I have felt that, that thing that you talked about where you feel like there's just, there's nowhere to go. I can't, I'm frozen from this. I can't move forward. And even when people are saying it's going to be fine, and even when I draw upon my past of, I've been in these kind of situations before, but I haven't thought to, go towards beauty and contemplation and art before.
Right. Well, one of the things that's really, fascinating to me is that, like, the Psalms themselves, like, they're poetry.
Right.
So if I'm in trouble, when we're in trouble, we often turn to the Psalms, which is interesting because we're often not aware that what I'm actually doing is turning to art.
Yeah.
What I often think I'm doing is, like, I'm turning to the Psalms to get my problem solved. I'm going to go there because if I read this Psalm, then that's the mechanical thing that I do, and then I'm going to feel better. As opposed to, actually, there may be some Psalms, this one included, where if I'm going to sit with this, it's not going to immediately give me the answer to solve my problem. It's going to invite me to be present and dwell in the house of the Lord. That's where it's going to start. And one of the things that we find is the Psalm as a piece of artwork itself becomes a way in which the mechanics of interpersonal neurobiology can be understood and applied with their intention without even recognizing that it is art. It is beauty itself that is drawing us into this place of healing. And in fact, it's exemplary of the fact that, like, art expands our imagination, right? When we go to see a Mark Rothko, like I'm going to, the first time, like, I'm like, what the heck? Like, what am I don't get it. Like, I'm just looking at, like, color on a wall. Like, I see color in my kitchen. I can go see color anywhere. I can just look at color. And that is part of the point, right? Because it's something that I need to have my imagination expanded and my encounter expanded. What's so interesting is that this is the story of all the characters in the Bible. I mean, if we think about it, Abraham had an encounter with a God that he didn't understand, and that God kept expanding. Like, yes, you're going to have a kid when you're 100, and you're like, what the heck? I've been trying for 75 years. I can't get a kid. And it's going to be with your wife. It's not going to be with this young woman. It's going to be with your wife. Like, your wife of, 70, 65 years. Like, it's going to be with your wife. wow, how, like, I have to expand my imagination. And then, of course, how all the Old Testament kings and prophets, they're all contending with a God that was unlike any other in Middle Eastern, kind of Canaanite religious cults. This was a different God who was asking my imagination to expand. And this God was inviting them to communicate with him in poetry and dramatic presentation. This is the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah isn't just a guy who's yapping at people. If you read Jeremiah, you find any number of times where he basically presents a dramatic presentation as the way that he's telling the message of God to the people. And then you get to the New Testament. The disciples, during and after Jesus' public ministry, like, they have an idea in their head about what the Messiah is supposed to be, and he shows up, and this isn't making any sense. And so they're going to have to reimagine the events of Jesus' life in light of the Old Testament texts. Like, how are we going to do this? And then they have to turn around and reimagine the meaning of those texts themselves. The whole Bible, the arc of the Bible, is one big imagination station. I mean, God expanding our capacity to imagine in a life that is full of trauma. The trauma begins in Genesis 3, Genesis 4. It intensifies with the murder of not just any murder, right? It's a brother who murders another, like, and then the whole Noah thing, like, that was a bummer day. That was just like all this violence. And God says, come and dwell and gaze and inquire. And all of that reflects how our brains work, bottom to top and right to left. We're not trying to shoehorn information. We're not just giving people solutions to problems. God didn't just send a missive 2,000 years ago on a piece of papyrus and says, these are all the things you need to do, and then everybody will be fine. No, Jesus came, lived, and died, and was raised. Bottom to top, right to left, embodiment before we have explanation. Like really good art, the healing of our lives and the recommissioning of our lives, like great art, is something that God shows us. It doesn't tell us. He doesn't explain it first. First, he shows us. And one of the first things that we are shown in Psalm 27:4 is, one thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek. Not 10 things, not 3 things, one thing. And that reminds me of this notion that, like, at the very outset, like, we're alerted that if healing is what we want, perseverance will be in order. We're going to have to practice over and over and over again. We like to say that there's this phrase, 2 millimeters per day. 2 millimeters per day. This notion that that's about how fast the neural networks are going to regenerate. And we think, like, that's not very, like, how long does it take me to drive from here to Philadelphia? Like 2 millimeters per day, that's a long time.
Yeah.
To get there. I wish God were faster. I wish it didn't take that much perseverance, but it does. And it reminds me of this one of the other members of our, you'll read about in the book, this woman Charlotte, who was doing all this really remarkable work, but then she would come back, every so often, and she would just feel so overwhelmed and embarrassed that somehow it hadn't yet taken, right? That she'd tell her story and she would feel seen, soothed, safe, secure, and would have this moment of epiphany, this moment of feeling felt, this moment of having her imagination expanded in the group. But then 3 or 4 weeks later, she'd come back and it would still feel the same, like something else has happened at home or in her business. And because she wasn't perfectly able to appropriate what she'd taken in the group 4 weeks ago, she feels ashamed that somehow I'm not enough for this process. And so my memory of my trauma becomes something that I practice even in the healing of my trauma.
Right.
I give shame the opportunity to be in charge, to have the talking stick, even in the process of the healing of my very shame that I'm experiencing. And so she herself had to practice perseverance in coming back and receiving over and over and over again. She was experiencing that healing and joy required for practice. But because she had to keep doing it, she just experienced that, easily interpreted that as evidence of failure because it wasn't being done, perfectly.
Yeah, but you've always said that change, happens when we are repeatedly doing the little things over and over and over again. It's not a do things once and then, you have this miraculous change. So this is in line with what you've been saying, all along.
Right. Well, I'm just thinking about our relationship, for example. I think, I remember like the very first weekend that we met.
Yeah.
And, it was kind of like love at first sight in some respects. Right? We just the amount of joy. I mean, on all of our team, like our team was just,
It was amazing.
really,
yeah,
it was amazing. And at the same time, I'm aware. And so you've got this felt sense of connection, but that sense of connection for the first, that first introduction, it in and of itself is not enough to hold it.
Right.
But over the course of years now, and over the course of your and my being vulnerable with each other, and, like there's very little about me that you don't know.
Right.
Very little about me that you don't know.
And
I mean, when I say that as a qualifier, because like, frankly, like I except for, what I had for dinner last night, which you don't know, but I had pizza. So now you do.
Right.
It takes practice. It takes we offer ourselves to each other gradually over time. And, I give you this thing. I'm going to trust you with this part of my heart. And then you trust me with that part of your heart. And over time, we work to, again, like create this ballast and this hard deck in which this relationship that you and I have, and the ones that I know that you have with others and that I have with others, like becomes the hard deck on which we walk into the world. And that takes the hard work of perseverance over and over and over again. As we've said, again, it's not unlike that notion of sitting with Rothko's work, that notion of working out our salvation with fear and trembling through perseverance that we read about in Romans chapter 5. And we'd like to say that like beauty can't be rushed. It's not easily achieved. And it's often not recognized. We also like to say that the brain can do a lot of hard work for a long time, as long as I don't have to do it by myself. And so we find ourselves with the beginning of this verse, we find ourselves beginning to imagine, right? That our imaginations, our imaginations need coaxing. Like if I had that near drowning event at the pool when I'm 4 years old, it may take me many weeks for me to get my feet back in that chlorinated water.
I remember when my daughter Hannah, my oldest daughter, was learning to ride a bike with the training wheels. And we were taking her out one of the first times, her My Little Pony training bicycle. And she was on a sidewalk and she was coming up to a driveway, which was slanted.
Yeah.
And she fell. And, like with a horse, you want him to get right back in the saddle. And,
right.
It took a long time to coax her to get back on. I mean, a long time to coax her to get back on that bike. And we just had to keep persevering and saying, okay, we're going to try again today. We're going to try again today, until, finally she got on it and was trusting us enough that we would be there with her along the way until we could let go, take the training wheels off eventually, and let her soar. But it was a long process because she kept reliving that trauma.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think your words just there. I mean, like, I think in many respects, that is the key. Gave her time to practice trusting that you are there. And literally the intensity of how my brainstem wants to override, my brainstem and my amygdala wants to override and draw my attention to fear, as opposed to paying attention to those who are with me in the room, is what keeps me from getting back on the bike.
Yeah.
And so if I have people who are willing to stay the course, even in the middle of intensified fear, this is what became true for Katrina. She was in the middle of intensified fear. Like, what am I, like, how, if I talk to my boss or bring this, or if I go to HR, I might lose my job. But because all the stories that we can tell about how bad this is going to be. But as she was able to share, like, she was able to say, what was most important is that I knew what I wanted. I wanted to be in a job that flourished. And I knew that you wanted me to be in that job, you, this community, and I'm going to take you with me. And even if something bad happens, I'm like, she would talk about, like, I could feel you in my chest and sense you between my temples. Could see you. That's an expansion of her imagination, something that 6 months prior to that, she didn't have. And as Ryan watched her tell this story and was in the room watching her develop the story over those 6 months, Ryan's story itself was already being transformed. As we like to say, you know, for kids who are coming to the high dive, right? You got some kids that come to the high dive, when the summer starts, and they, for the first time, they go right up the ladder and off the dive, and other kids are sitting on their towel, and it takes them to the end of the summer before they're willing to get up the courage to, go over to the bottom of the slide and bottom of the ladder, and then up the ladder and down the ladder, like out and back, and they finally go out. And you say, well, gosh, it's good to know that you finally went off. To which we would say, actually, no. They've been going off from the first day that the pool opened this summer, but it's only 2 millimeters per day. And so for all of us who are listening, who are worried about life not happening fast enough, change not happening fast enough, I want us to be aware that even God is a God who perseveres with us. God is practicing in that sense. God knows exactly what it's like. Jesus knows exactly what it's like to have to practice being with people who are taking a long time to get someplace. And we are having to practice being with ourselves. And so to the degree that we, like Hannah, is willing to allow, imagine if Hannah had the thought, like, well, when are my parents going to lose patience with me? And because I'm sure that they are, I'm just not going to get on the bike, because I don't want to have to put up with the moment when they say to me, oh, we're done.
Right.
But you stay with her and you give her every indication that this is really hard. And the more we practice, the more we persevere, the better it gets. And not only because you become more successful at what you're trying to do, but because with every skin knee, our relationship actually becomes more deeply connected, because we're not leaving the room in the face of your trauma. And this is what we would say, that when Jesus says to us, lo, I am with you always, it's not just a convenient throwaway line at the end of a life. It's him saying, perseverance is really hard. The psalmist knew it. Abraham knew it. I know it. And you're going to discover that it's really hard. And you need to know, for all of your falling down off the bike, I'm not leaving the room. I've started this good work in you. I will finish it, no matter how long this takes. And for our listeners, I really want us today to be hopeful, even if it's only 2 millimeters further down the road, more hopeful, because we aren't leaving the room.
I just, there's something very hopeful about the fact that it's okay that it's 2 millimeters a day.
Right.
Right. We all want, we see things as problems that we want to solve right away. We want change to happen so fast. And yet, we can't even imagine a better future unless we have each other, and unless we know that this is going to take time. I mean, it's going to take time. Rome wasn't built in a day, from what I understand.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
2 millimeters a day.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, this was great, Curt. I'm loving the book, and I've told you that I'm reading, just keeping up with our conversations about it so that it's fresh and everything. So I'm looking forward to reading the next chapter on Dwell, which is what we're going to be talking about next week. So I encourage all of you to keep up the pace, and we'll be talking about Dwell next week. And obviously, you can listen to these as slow as you like and as many times as you like.
Yes, indeed.
Knowing that it's only 2 millimeters a day. Yeah.
Right on.
Thanks, Curt. This is great.
All right, man. Love you, man.
You too.
Yep. See ya.
This podcast is produced by Curt Thompson, Pepper Sweeney, and myself, Amy Chella. Audio production and editing is by Keaton Simons. Video production and editing is done by Mark Gould. If you'd like to connect with us, you can find us on social media at BeingKnownPod. If you like this podcast, tell a friend. If you love this podcast, tell everyone you know. And please like, rate, and review wherever you listen. Be well, be known.